The entry was dated wrong. That was the first thing Soren Kale noticed when the archive clerk placed the bound folio on the reading table. The date stamp on the cover read 4,211 years before the current Confederacy reckoning, which placed it 60 years before the Confederacy existed. He turned the folio over in his hands. The vacuum seal had held. The binding was intact, old tercel archival technique, resin-bonded spine, pressure-cured leaves. Not a reproduction, not a forgery made to look aged. The material itself was genuinely old, and the date stamp was impossible, and impossible things were Soren Kale's specialty. He was the Confederacy's senior archivist for closed sectors, the historian who cataloged the places the galaxy had agreed to forget. 1,700 sealed files sat in the vaults behind him. Dead empires, collapsed trade corridors, quarantine systems where the radiation still sang in frequencies that melted sensor arrays. Routine work mostly. The galaxy was old, and old things left remains the way old fires left ash. Someone had to sweep it up. Someone had to label it and file it and make sure no one stumbled into the wrong ruin and triggered something that should have stayed buried. Kale had done this work for 17 years. He was methodical. He was careful. He was trusted in the way that people trusted the man who locked the doors at night, not because he was important, but because the things behind the doors were. But file 2230, 1 TRR, was not routine. It had arrived 6 days earlier in a diplomatic pouch from the tercel convocation, one of the 3 founding species of the Confederacy, the oldest by a considerable margin. The pouch had been stamped with the highest classification tier Kale had ever seen applied to non-military material. The cover note was printed on heavy stock, embossed with the convocation's official seal, and it said only, "For archival review, provenance verification requested." No analyst's name, no department. No context, just a file number and the wrong date. Kale ran his thumb across the seal one more time, feeling the raised edges of the convocation's glyph. Then he opened the folio. Inside was a single document, a personal log, handwritten in the old tercel script that predated machine transcription by centuries. The characters were small and precise, the work of someone trained to write in cramped conditions, shipboard perhaps, or in a monitoring station where space was rationed. The ink had been chemically dated and verified by the convocation's own material sciences division. Their finding was appended on a separate leaf, signed by 3 independent analysts. The ink matched the date. The paper matched the date. The binding resin matched the date. 4,211 years old. The author identified himself as Vane Torales, senior listener of the Tercel Deep Signal Corps, a military intelligence branch that Kale knew by reputation. The Corps had been the convocation's ears in deep space for over 1,000 years before it was dissolved, 3 centuries before Kale was born, in a reorganization that the official history described as a budgetary measure. Senior listener was a mid-level rank, a field analyst, not a commander, someone who sat in a chair in a dark room and listened to the void. Kale cross-referenced the name. Vane Torales appeared in exactly one other record in the entire Confederacy archive, a personnel roster from the Deep Signal Corps' final operational year, listed as missing, presumed dead, sector unknown. No investigation file, no search and recovery notation, just the listing and the silence that followed it. Kale adjusted the reading light, pulled a notation pad from his desk, and began. The log opened without preamble, no date header, no greeting, no standard mission report formatting, just the words laid down in that precise, cramped hand. If you are reading this, I have failed to destroy it. I wrote it because I could not carry what I learned alone. I have tried to carry it. For 9 years I have tried. The weight has not lessened. It has grown. I am putting it down now on paper that will outlast me, and I am walking away, and I do not think I will come back for it. If you are a military officer, I ask you to seal this and forget it. If you are a historian, I ask you to understand what I could not, that some knowledge is not a gift. Some knowledge is a door, and behind it is a room that is already occupied, and the occupant has been waiting to see if you were foolish enough to open it. Cale noted the emotional register, controlled but fraying at the edges. Torales had been trained as an intelligence listener, a role that demanded clinical detachment above all else. Whatever had broken that detachment had done so thoroughly. The opening paragraph read like a man leaving a confession, not filing a report. The first substantive entry was dated 11 years before the log itself, placing it 4,222 years before the present. Torales described his assignment: a deep space listening post designated Station Kethry, positioned at the leading edge of what was then called the Vone Reach. The name triggered immediate recognition. Cale knew it, not from his current files, but from the legacy indices that sat beneath the active archive like geological strata beneath a city. The Vone Reach was a former navigational designation for a region the modern Confederacy knew by a different clinical label: Exclusion Zone 7. The zone that contained human space. Cale's hands went still on the folio. He stared at the words Vone Reach for a long moment, then looked up at the archive shelves behind him, row upon row of sealed files, each one tagged with a sector designation, each one containing the documented history of a place the galaxy had closed off. He knew every file in those shelves. He had cataloged them himself. Exclusion Zone 7 had no file. It appeared in the closed sector's archive only as a boundary marker, a thick red line on the navigational charts with no annotation, no history, no incident reports, no survey data. Every other closed sector in Cale's archive had a file. Irradiated systems had files. Collapsed civilizations had files. Even the sectors quarantined after biological contamination events, sectors where the air itself would kill you, had files. Sealed, classified, restricted, layered behind authorization keys but present, documented, known. Exclusion Zone 7 had nothing. It existed on the charts as a shape without a story. And in 17 years as senior archivist, Cale had never once been asked to investigate that absence. He had noticed it, of course. A historian who failed to notice a gap in the record was not much of a historian. But the gap had always seemed administrative. Old data cleared during a system migration. Routine archival housekeeping from an era before his tenure. Not worth the political friction of filing an inquiry with the convocation. He turned the page. Torales described Station Kethry in the flat, practical prose of a field report. A 6-person crew operating a passive sensor array anchored to a carbonaceous asteroid at the edge of Tercel-claimed space. No weapons, no ship dock. No defensive capability of any kind, just a listening platform, a crew quarters module, a small hydroponics bay, and the array itself. A web of antennae spread across the asteroid's surface like the nervous system of something that had learned to listen, and nothing else. Their mission was routine border monitoring, cataloging signal traffic, tracking debris fields, noting any anomalous energy signatures that might indicate undocumented activity in the Vone Reach. The Reach was considered a dead zone, no active civilizations, no navigational hazards, no strategic value, no reason for anyone to go there, and no evidence that anyone had. The assignment was a career placeholder, the kind of post you sent analysts to when there was nowhere better to put them and no reason to bring them home. Torales had been there for 30 months when something changed. For the first 30 months, he reported nothing. Signal traffic was zero. Debris fields were ancient and fully mapped. Energy signatures were background level, consistent with the natural radiation of an old, quiet region of space. He filled his reports with spectrographic data and drift calculations, and the slow, grinding tedium of watching empty space do nothing. His crew rotated through monitoring shifts, ran maintenance on the array, grew vegetables in the hydroponics bay, and waited for their reassignment orders. Then in month 31, the array picked up a signal. Torales was on shift when it registered, alone in the monitoring bay, running a routine calibration sweep. The signal appeared on his display as a single line, steady and unwavering, cutting through the background noise like a blade laid flat on a table. It was not a communication signal. Torales was explicit about this. He had been trained to classify signal types, and what the array detected did not match any known category in the deep signal core library. It was a low-frequency resonance, steady and unmodulated, carrying no data, no structure, no variation. It did not pulse. It did not shift. It simply existed, a tone, holding constant, as though something very large and very far away was vibrating at a single frequency, and had been doing so for a very long time. Torales logged the signal and filed a routine report with Tercel Command. The response came back in 11 days, standard transit time for a subspace relay chain of that length. Acknowledged. Continue monitoring. No further action required. He continued monitoring. The signal did not change. It did not strengthen. It did not weaken. It held its frequency with a stability that Torales described as mechanical, not the natural drift of a stellar phenomenon, not the modulation of a pulsar or a magnetar, but the deliberate, maintained output of something built to produce exactly this sound and nothing else. He ran the signal through every classification algorithm in the core library. None returned a match. He asked his communications specialist, a younger analyst named Dreth, fresh from the academy, to review his findings independently. Dreth confirmed the signal's existence, confirmed its anomalous nature, and then, in a footnote that Torales underlined twice in his log, added, "Origin bearing places the source inside the reach. No catalogued emitter in that bearing. Recommend reclassification of sector status from inactive to monitored." Torales did not file the reclassification request. He told Dreth the signal was likely a deep space echo, a residual reflection from a natural source, not worth the paperwork. Dreth accepted this. Torales noted in his log that the lie came easily and that this troubled him. Over the next 6 months, he mapped the signal's origin point with increasing precision, using the array's baseline separation to triangulate bearing and distance. The signal was coming from a region approximately 340 light-years inside the Von reach, deep inside the dead zone, far beyond any charted territory, far beyond any point that a Tercel vessel had visited in living memory, far beyond the point where the navigational charts stopped. And that was where Torales found the first anomaly in the charts themselves. The station's legacy database contained navigational records going back over 1,000 years, old charts, superseded by newer versions, kept in storage as a matter of archival practice. Torales, driven by the signal and by the professional curiosity of a man who had spent 30 months with nothing to be curious about, pulled the oldest charts he could find and compared them to his current operational set. The difference was not subtle. The old charts, the ones dating back 1,000 years and more, showed the Von reach as a navigable region, trade routes marked in the standard color coding of the era, colony markers at least 12 spread across the interior of the reach, signal relay stations, fuel depots, a navigational corridor running through the heart of the region like a highway, connecting the reach to the broader Tercel transit network, a normal sector of populated, commercially active space. Then, at a certain date, the marks ended. Not gradually, not with a notation of war or plague or economic collapse or any of the documented reasons that sectors went dark. They simply stopped, as though someone had drawn a line across the chart and said, "Nothing passed here." No annotation, no explanation, no record of what had happened to the colonies, the trade routes, the relay stations, the navigational corridor, just the line, and beyond the line, empty space. The newer charts, the ones Torales had been issued for his deployment, did not show even that. The line was gone. The old trade routes were gone. The colony markers were gone. The Vone Reach was rendered as empty space, unmarked and unnamed, as though nothing had ever been there. No indication that the region had ever been anything other than what it appeared to be, a dead zone, unremarkable and avoided. But something had been there. The old charts proved it. 1,000 years ago, ships had traveled through this space. People had lived here. Commerce had flowed. And then it had all stopped, and the stopping had been covered over, and the covering over had been covered over again, until the region that used to have a history had nothing, not even the memory that a history had once existed. And now, in that erased space, something was broadcasting a tone that had not changed in all the time Torales had been listening to it. Cale set the folio down. His throat was dry. The reading room felt smaller than it had when he sat down, the walls closer, the ceiling lower, the shadows in the corners thicker. He recognized the pattern Torales was describing because he had seen it in his own archive, applied to Exclusion Zone 7. The same systematic erasure, charts overwritten, data scrubbed, files deleted without notation. A region with a history, stripped of that history and presented to the galaxy as a blank. He had always assumed it was administrative. He poured water from the carafe on his desk, drank half the glass, and picked the folio back up. Torales had made a decision. Without authorization, without notifying Tercel Command, without logging the departure in the station's transit record, he had taken Station Kethry's survey shuttle, a short-range vessel with no weapons, minimal shielding, and a drive rated for in-system transit, not deep space travel, and flown it into the Vone Reach, following the signal. He told his crew he was running a calibration pass on the outer sensor nodes. He told himself he would turn back at the first sign of danger. He did not tell himself the truth, which he admitted later in the log, that he had no intention of turning back, that the signal had become the only interesting thing in his life, and that the erasure of the charts had transformed his professional curiosity into something harder and more dangerous, the need to know. The log entries from the transit were sparse. Distance markers, fuel consumption rates, radiation readings that Torales tracked with the precision of a man aware that his shuttle's shielding was inadequate for the kind of travel he was attempting. He noted that the background radiation increased for the first 2 days, consistent with the expected profile of interstellar space at that distance from the galactic arm. Then, unexpectedly, it decreased, dropping below the ambient level, then dropping further as though something ahead of him was absorbing it, not reflecting it, not scattering it, absorbing it, a region of space that was quieter than the void itself. He noted that his navigation instruments began to drift. Not dramatically, not the catastrophic failure that would indicate a hardware malfunction or a spatial anomaly, but steadily, a fraction of a degree per hour, as though the local spacetime geometry was slightly different from what the charts predicted, as though the space itself had been shaped by something, long ago, and the shaping had left residual effects that his instruments could detect but not correct for. On day 9 of the transit, he found the first marker. It was a beacon, dark, unpowered, tumbling slowly in the void with the lazy rotation of an object that had been drifting for a very long time. Torales matched velocity and examined it at close range, running the shuttle's survey instruments across its surface for 3 hours. The construction was unfamiliar. The alloy did not match any material in the Tercel database. Not a known alloy, not a theoretical alloy, not even a close approximation. The crystalline structure of the metal suggested manufacturing techniques that the Tercel had never developed and, as far as Torales could determine, had never conceived of. But the shape was unmistakable. It was a navigational buoy, the kind placed along established transit corridors to guide commercial traffic. A simple, functional object. The kind of thing you built by the thousand and scattered along a trade route to keep freighters from drifting off course. Someone had built a shipping lane through this space. The buoy was dead. Its power source, a compact fusion cell, miniaturized beyond anything in the Tercel catalog, had been exhausted long before Torales found it. But the structural analysis he ran on the hull returned an estimated age that made him reread the result 3 times. The buoy was older than the Tercel civilization. Not older than the Tercel convocation, the political entity. Older than the Tercel species recorded history. Older than the earliest archaeological evidence of Tercel tool use. Older than the cave markings on Tercel Prime that were considered the first evidence of symbolic thought. This buoy had been placed in space, while the Tercel were still digging roots with their hands, before they had looked up at the stars and wondered what was there. And it was a shipping buoy, a routine commercial navigation marker, as unremarkable in its function as a signpost on a road, which meant that whoever had placed it had been traveling this corridor routinely, running commerce through this space as a matter of daily business, at a time when the Tercel did not yet exist as a civilization, let alone a spacefaring species. Cale felt something he had not felt in 17 years of archival work. Not excitement, not curiosity, though curiosity was part of it, something colder and deeper, sitting in his chest like a stone that had been dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward through his body, reaching his hands, his throat, the back of his skull. The feeling a historian gets when the archive opens a door it was never supposed to open. Dread. Torales found more markers as he continued along the signal's bearing. Dead relay stations, structures the size of small buildings, dark and cold, drifting in formations that suggested they had once been anchored to fixed coordinates. The carbonized remains of what might have been a refueling platform, a structure large enough to service commercial vessels, its fuel tanks long since emptied, its docking arms still extended as though waiting for ships that would never arrive. A debris field that spectral analysis dated to roughly the same era as the first buoy, fragments of hull plating, structural members, the scattered remains of something that had been built and then broken, a very long time ago. All of it dark, all of it dead, all of it impossibly old. And all of it built to the same design standard, by the same civilization, using the same alloys that did not appear in any database the Confederacy maintained, alloys that spoke of a manufacturing capability so far beyond the Tercel that the gap was not technological but categorical. Not a better version of the same science. A different science entirely. Torales passed 11 dead markers. He cataloged each one. He ran spectral analyses, structural assessments, age estimates. He compiled a dataset that would have been the most significant xenoarchaeological discovery in Confederacy history if he had ever submitted it. He did not submit it, he kept flying. The 4th relay station was the one that unsettled him most. It was larger than the others, a hub, he thought, where multiple shipping lanes had converged. Its interior was partially exposed where a hull panel had drifted free over the millennia, and his shuttle's external camera captured what was inside. Rows of docking cradles, sized for vessels of varying tonnage, still arranged in the neat geometric pattern of a well-managed port facility. Nothing was in the cradles, but the cradles were intact. They had been waiting, in the dark and the cold, for ships that would never dock again. For longer than Cale's entire species had possessed the concept of a ship. Torales noted something else about the relay stations that deepened the wrongness. Their design did not match the buoys. The buoys were simple, functional, minimal, utilitarian. The relay stations showed a different hand, heavier construction, denser alloys, defensive hardpoints that the commercial buoys lacked. The relay stations had been built by someone who expected trouble. The buoys had been built by someone who did not. 2 builders, 2 civilizations sharing the same corridor. One that built commerce infrastructure with the casual confidence of a species that had never been threatened. One that built military infrastructure alongside it, watching the corridor, guarding it. Torales could not determine which had come first or whether they had existed simultaneously. But the implication was clear. The Vone Reach had not been home to one civilization. It had been home to at least two, and both were gone. On day 14, he found the structure. He did not describe it immediately. The log entry for that day began with a line that Cale read twice, then a third time, then sat with for a long moment before continuing. I am not going to describe what I am looking at because I do not believe I am looking at it. I am going to run the instruments and report what they tell me. I am going to trust the instruments because I do not trust my own perception. The entry that followed was clinical. Torales retreating into his training as a listener, cataloging facts rather than processing them, using the discipline of measurement to hold back something that measurement could not contain. An object in stable orbit around a brown dwarf star, a star too dim to appear on any chart, too cool to radiate in any frequency the Tercel normally scanned for, invisible to everything except the kind of deep passive sensor array that only a listening post would carry. Dimensions: approximately 4,200 kilometers at its longest axis, roughly spheroid, with structural protrusions at regular intervals along its equatorial plane, docking arms, weapons emplacements, sensor arrays, the infrastructure of a military installation built on a scale that made Torales' shuttle look like a grain of sand on a beach. Composition: the same unknown alloy as the buoys and relay stations. Age estimate: consistent with the other structures, placing it in the same era, thousands of years before the Tercel existed as a civilization. It was a station, or a fortress, or a command platform, or something that served functions Torales could not name because the civilization that built it had capabilities he could not imagine. The protrusions along its equator were weapon mounts. He recognized the geometry even though the scale was wrong, the way you recognize a blade even when it is larger than your body. It was dark, no power signatures, no energy emissions, no atmosphere readings from the interior, dead like everything else he had found in the Vone Reach. Except for the signal. The signal was coming from inside the structure. The origin point that Torales had been tracking for months, the tone that had drawn him 340 light-years into erased space, was broadcasting from somewhere deep inside the largest dead structure he had ever seen. Cale set the folio down again. He was aware of his own breathing, the steady rhythm of it, mechanical and automatic, the kind of thing you noticed only when everything else had gone quiet. The archive was empty. It was the middle of the station's night cycle, and he had come here alone, telling no one what he had received, telling no one about the diplomatic pouch or the classification stamp or the impossible date. He had done this because the classification stamp had frightened him, in a way he could not articulate at the time, but was beginning to understand now. He turned the page. Torales had not entered the structure. His shuttle was not equipped for it. No airlock rated for structures of that scale. No power supply capable of running the survey instruments for the time an internal exploration would require. No environmental suit rated for an atmosphere of unknown composition or an interior of unknown geometry. But it was not the equipment that stopped him. He admitted this plainly. Something stopped him. He described it as a feeling, an impression, irrational and impossible to quantify with the instruments available to him, that the structure was aware of his presence, not watching him through sensors, not scanning him with active systems. Aware the way a sleeping animal is aware of movement near its body, a readiness below consciousness, a stillness that was not the same as absence. The signal had not changed when he approached. The structure had not reacted in any way his instruments could detect. But Torales, a man trained to sit in silence and listen to the void for months at a time, a man whose entire professional skill set was built on detecting the difference between nothing and something, felt certain, with the certainty that came from years of practiced attention, that his presence had been noted. He retreated to a distance of 200 kilometers and spent 3 days running passive scans, cataloging everything his shuttle's instruments could detect without broadcasting a signal of their own. What he found was worse than the structure itself. The damage, he had noticed it from a distance, the deformation of the hull, the areas where the surface was buckled inward, the weapon mounts that were bent and crushed like stems stepped on by something vast, was not random. It followed a pattern. The impacts were concentrated on the structure's defensive systems, weapon emplacements, shield generator housings, sensor arrays, the structural members that supported the equatorial weapons ring. Whoever had struck this station had targeted its ability to fight back with surgical precision, disabling it section by section, system by system, with the methodical patience of a surgeon removing a tumor. And the weapon that had done the damage was not kinetic, not energy-based. Not any weapons technology the Tercel had ever encountered, theorized about, or imagined in their most speculative military research. The deformation pattern was consistent with gravitational manipulation. The hull had been crushed inward as though local gravity had been increased by a factor of several hundred, concentrated in areas no larger than a room, then released. The metal had not been melted. It had not been cut. It had been pressed, folded, closed the way a hand closes around something it intends to hold. Not an explosion, not a beam, not a weapon in any sense that the word could accommodate. A hand closing, and then opening, and then closing again on the next system and the next, until the station could no longer fight. Torales had found a battlefield. A very old battlefield. The losing side's largest installation, still here, tumbling in the dark around a dead star that no chart showed, with something inside it still broadcasting a single tone into the void, a tone that had been playing for longer than the Tercel had existed. Cale turned to the next section of the log, the section that changed everything. Torales had turned his survey shuttle around and begun the transit back to Station Kethri. He had seen enough. The dead markers, the impossible structure, the gravitational weapon signatures. He had cataloged all of it, and the catalog had filled him with a cold, rational fear that overrode his curiosity and told him to go home. On day 4 of the return trip, he picked up a second signal. This one was different. It was not a tone. It was a transmission, structured, modulated carrying data. It appeared on his shuttle's communications receiver, which should have been impossible. The receiver was a short-range unit, designed for intrasystem traffic, not deep space communication. Whatever was sending this signal was either very close or very powerful. And it was not coming from behind him, not from the ancient structure. It was coming from ahead, from the direction of the Vone Reach's inner boundary. From the direction of the region, the modern charts left blank. Torales decrypted the transmission using the Deep Signal Core standard cipher protocols. He did this automatically, the reflex of a trained listener running through his classification procedure. It should not have worked. The transmission was not Tercel in origin, and there was no reason a non-Tercel signal would be encrypted in a Tercel cipher. But it was. The cipher matched perfectly, not approximately, not close enough to suggest a shared mathematical basis. Perfectly, as though whoever had encoded the message had access to the Deep Signal Core own cipher library, had selected the specific cipher Torales would use, and had encrypted the message for him, personally, knowing exactly who would receive it and how he would attempt to read it. The message, when he read it, was 7 words long. "You were not meant to come here." Cale read the line 3 times. Then he closed the folio and sat in the dark for a long time. The archive hummed around him, the low vibration of the station's power systems, the whisper of the environmental controls, the distant pulse of the navigational beacon on the station's exterior. Normal sounds. The sounds of a functioning station, going about its business in the middle of the night, unaware that a historian in a reading room was holding a document that turned the galaxy's history inside out. When he opened the folio again, the log had changed. The clinical distance was gone. Torales was still writing in his precise, cramped hand, but the voice beneath the handwriting had shifted, the detachment replaced by something rawer, something Cale recognized from other documents in his archive, the sealed file documents that never made it into the public record. The voice of someone who knows they are recording something that will not be believed, and who has decided to record it anyway because the alternative, silence, is worse. Transmission had continued. Not a loop, not a pre-recorded message triggered by proximity. A response to him specifically adapting to his trajectory, following his shuttle as he adjusted course, matching his frequency shifts as he tried to lose the signal. The messages were short, declarative, and written in flawless old tercel script, a language that had not been spoken outside tercel academic institutions for over 1,000 years. A dead language, preserved in archives and taught to scholars. And someone, or something, in the blank space on the charts was using it to talk to a man in a survey shuttle who should not have been there. The beacons were placed to mark the boundary. The boundary was placed to protect you. Torales noted the time stamp between messages. He noted the signal strength. He noted the bearing. He kept listening, because listening was what he had been trained to do, even when the thing he was listening to made the training feel like a child's game played in a room that had suddenly opened into the dark. The structure you found was the last defensive position of the Kelvrathi hegemony. They held it for 11 years. They were the strongest military power in this region of the galaxy. A pause. Torales noted the duration, 47 seconds. Then, they are gone now. Another pause, longer this time. Torales measured it at 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Then, we did not mean for them to be gone. We asked them to stop. We sent envoys. We sent warnings. We offered terms that cost us nothing to grant and would have cost them nothing to accept. They did not stop. They chose war. The war lasted 11 years, and when it was over there were no Kelvrathi left to accept the peace. We built the boundary after that. We silenced the CHARTS. We removed the records. We erased the trade routes and the colony markers and the navigational corridors. We did this so that no one would come looking for what was here, so that no one would find the Kelvrathi's remains and ask what happened to them, so that no one would cross the line and force us to answer that question with anything other than silence. We are still here. Please go home. Cale read the messages twice. He read them a third time. He read them the way a historian reads a primary source, looking for structure, for rhetoric, for the assumptions embedded in the grammar. And what he found in the grammar was something that the words themselves did not say, but the structure made inescapable. Whoever had sent these messages was not threatening Torales. They were not warning him in the way that a military power warns an intruder. There was no aggression in the syntax. No ultimatum, no deadline. There was grief. The messages read like an apology written by someone who knew the apology was inadequate, who knew that the thing they had done could not be apologized for, and who had spent 4,000 years sitting with that knowledge, and who was now saying the only thing they could say to the next person who came close enough to hear it: please go home. Please do not make us do this again. Torales noted that the transmission source was not a ship. It was not a station. The signal analysis indicated a point source, a single location, stationary, fixed in space somewhere inside the blank region of the charts. Something permanent. Something that had been sitting in that space for over 4,000 years, monitoring the border, listening to every signal that crossed the perimeter, and had chosen this moment to speak, because a single tercel analyst in a survey shuttle had crossed the line and gotten close enough to the truth to be dangerous. Not dangerous to them, dangerous to himself, because the truth, once known, became a thing that had to be acted on or buried, and either action had consequences that Torales was only beginning to understand. The final transmission came as Torales crossed back over the boundary line. The line that no longer appeared on the modern charts, but that the old charts still showed. The line where the colony markers ended and the blank space began. It was one sentence. The tone you heard is for the KELVRATHI. We will play IT until there is no one left to remember that they existed. That will be a very long time. We are patient. Cale turned to the final pages of the log. Torales made it back to Station Kethri. He did not file a report. He did not contact Tercel Command. He dismantled the station's long-range communication array, citing a fabricated malfunction. He erased the sensor logs, the navigation records, and the shuttle's flight data. He told his crew that the shuttle trip had been a routine calibration run, and that the communication array would be repaired at the next scheduled maintenance window. Then he sat down in the monitoring bay, alone, in the dark, with the array still picking up the tone from the dead structure 340 light-years away, and wrote this document. He wrote it in longhand, by chemical light, on physical paper, because he did not trust any electronic medium to remain unmonitored. He wrote it over the course of 3 days, sleeping in intervals, eating when he remembered to, filling page after page with the cramped, precise script of a man who had been trained to record what he heard, and was now recording the one thing he wished he had never heard. The final entry was dated 9 years after the shuttle flight. Torales had left the Deep Signal Corps by then, resigned his commission, taken a civilian posting on a terrestrial agricultural world, settled into a life that was deliberately, aggressively ordinary. He had not spoken of what he found to anyone. He had not returned to the Vone Reach. He had not listened to the signal again. His final paragraph read, I have spent 9 years trying to understand what I encountered in the Vone Reach. I have not succeeded, and I no longer believe success is possible, because understanding requires a frame of reference and I have none. What I know is this. The region the Confederacy has designated as Exclusion Zone 7 is not empty. It is occupied. It has been occupied for longer than our civilization has existed, longer perhaps, than any civilization in the Confederacy has existed. The occupants are capable of erasing a starfaring hegemony from existence, and then erasing the record of that hegemony so thoroughly that no one remembers they were ever there. They built the boundary. They silenced the charts. They removed themselves from our history. And they did all of this not as an act of conquest, but as an act of mercy, because the alternative was that someone else would cross the line, and the crossing would become a confrontation, and the confrontation would become a war, and the war would end the way the war with the Kelvrathi ended, and they did not want that. I believe them. I believe they did not want the Kelvrathi to be gone. I believe the signal from inside the Kelvrathi station, that single, steady tone that has been broadcasting for 4,000 years into the void, is not a distress call and not a navigational marker and not a beacon of any kind. It is a memorial. They left it playing for the dead. And I believe that if I publish this log, or transmit it, or speak its contents aloud to a room of officers or historians or politicians who would hear the words and think opportunity instead of warning, they will know. Not because they are watching, because they are listening. They have always been listening. They heard me the moment I crossed the line. They will hear this document the moment it reaches another mind. And they will do what they have always done. They will come, and they will be patient, and they will ask us to stop. And if we do not stop, the tone inside the Kelvrathi station will not be the only memorial broadcasting in the Vone Reach. The log ended there. No signature, no closing formula, no date notation beneath the final line, just the words and then blank paper, as though Torales had set down the pen and walked away from the table and never come back. Soren Cale sat in the archive reading room for a long time after he finished. The folio was real. The ink dating was verified. The personnel record for Vane Torales was confirmed. The old charts showing the Vone Reach as populated space. Cale pulled them from the archive's legacy database, bypassing 3 layers of access restriction with his senior archivist credentials, and verified them in under an hour. The trade routes were there. The colony markers were there. 12 colonies, a navigational corridor, a commerce infrastructure consistent with a functioning sector of galactic civilization. And the systematic erasure of those charts from the modern navigational record was there too. He could trace it. He could see where the data had been overwritten, layer by layer, addition by addition. The colony markers removed first, then the trade routes, then the navigational corridor, then the relay stations, then the sector name itself, replaced with a numeric designation that carried no history and invited no questions. He could see the timestamps on each edit. They spanned centuries. Whoever had erased the charts had done so gradually, methodically, over the course of generations. Not a single act of censorship, but a sustained campaign of forgetting, carried out with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. The Kelvrathi, Cale searched the Confederacy's historical database. Nothing. He searched the academic repositories, every university archive in the Confederacy's educational network, over 400 institutions spanning 11 species. Nothing. He searched the Xenoarchaeological Survey records. Nothing. He searched the diplomatic archives, treaties, trade agreements, territorial disputes, going back to the Confederacy's founding and beyond, into the pre-Confederacy records maintained by the founding species individually. Nothing. He searched the military intelligence indices, the cultural heritage registries, the linguistic databases that cataloged every known and extinct language in the galactic record. Nothing. He searched the Tercel Convocation's own internal archives, the deepest records he had access to, the ones that predated the Confederacy by millennia. Nothing. Not one reference. Not one mention. Not a single allusion to a civilization called the Kelvrathi in any record maintained by any species in the Confederacy. A starfaring hegemony powerful enough to build a military installation 4,200 kilometers across, powerful enough to hold that installation for 11 years against a force that could crush metal with gravity, and there was no record of them anywhere. No ruins catalogued. No artifacts in any museum. No academic papers. No myths. No folklore. No whispered stories passed down through generations. Nothing. They had been erased so completely that not even the shape of their absence remained. Not a gap in the record. Not a suspicious blank. Not the kind of void that a careful historian could detect and flag for investigation. They were simply not there, and they had not been there for so long that no one remembered that they had ever been there. Except for the old charts. Except for the dead buoys tumbling in the dark. Except for the tone, the steady, unmodulated tone, broadcasting from inside a crushed station in orbit around a brown dwarf star that no chart showed, playing for 4,000 years for an audience that no longer existed. Playing for the dead. Cale closed the folio. He placed it back in its vacuum sleeve, pressing the edges until the seal engaged. He entered the classification code into the archive's cataloging system. The highest tier, the one that required 3 separate authorization keys to access and left no search footprint in the public index. Then he paused. The log had warned him. Torales had been explicit. They are listening. They heard me the moment I crossed the line. They will hear this document the moment it reaches another mind. Cale had read it. Another mind had received it. The informational boundary had been crossed. If Torales was right, if the occupants of the blank zone were what the log described, then Cale's act of reading was itself a transgression. Not of a physical border, not of a navigational line drawn on a chart, but of the informational one. The knowledge was the line, and he had crossed it. He sat with this for a long time. The reading room was silent. The archive was dark. The station hummed with its distant mechanical pulse, and beyond the station walls the void stretched in every direction, and somewhere in that void, in the blank space on the charts, in the region that had been erased so thoroughly that the erasure was invisible, something was listening. He thought about the Kelvrathi, a hegemony, fleets, colonies, trade routes, military installations, a civilization with a history and a population and a name, and now there was nothing, not rubble, not ruins that archaeologists could dig through and reconstruct, not a defeated people scattered across refugee worlds, keeping their language alive in exile. They did not exist. The galaxy had forgotten them so completely that the forgetting itself had been forgotten, and then the record of the forgetting had been erased, and then the tools used to erase it had been put away, and the people who had used the tools had retired, and their successors had inherited a clean archive and assumed it had always been clean. He thought about the messages Toralis had received. We did not mean for them to be gone. We asked them to stop. They had asked. The messages were clear on this point. They had asked. Envoys, warnings, terms that cost nothing to accept. And the Kelvrathi, whoever they had been, however powerful they had been, with their 4,200-kilometer fortress and their military hegemony and their 11-year war, had refused. And the refusal had been met not with anger but with continuation. 11 more years of asking. 11 more years of patience. And then the patience had run out, not because the occupants of the blank zone had grown tired of waiting, but because the Kelvrathi had left them no other choice, and the choice that remained was the one they had been trying to avoid since the beginning. And when it was done, when the last Kelvrathi installation was dark and the last Kelvrathi fleet was debris and the last Kelvrathi colony was empty, they had not celebrated. They had not claimed the territory. They had not built monuments to their victory or renamed the sector or recorded the war in their own histories as a triumph. They had built a memorial, a tone, a single frequency, playing inside the wreckage of the civilization they had destroyed, playing for the dead who could not hear it and the living who were never meant to find it. And then they had erased the charts. Cale sealed the folio. He entered the final catalog notation, the one that would bury the file in the deepest stratum of the archive, beneath layers of classification that would take decades to unspool, behind authorization keys held by people who did not know what the keys opened. He gave it a provenance tag, unverifiable single source. He gave it a subject code, Exclusion Zone 7, historical anomaly, no corroborating records. He gave it a recommendation, no further investigation warranted, archive and seal. His hand hovered over the confirmation key. He was a historian. His entire career had been built on the conviction that the archive existed to preserve knowledge, that the act of recording was sacred, that even the most dangerous information was safer cataloged than suppressed, that the truth was always preferable to the silence. He had argued this position in funding hearings, in policy meetings, in the quiet conversations that shaped how the Confederacy managed its relationship with its own past. Knowledge is never the enemy, he had said more than once to more than one audience. Ignorance is the enemy. The archive is the shield. He pressed the key. The folio vanished into the sealed stratum. He pulled up the navigational charts for Exclusion Zone 7 and looked at the boundary, the thick red line that marked the edge of the blank region, the line with no annotation, no history, no explanation. He looked at the blank space inside the line. He looked at where the colony markers had been, and the trade routes, and the navigational corridor that had once connected the Vone Reach to the rest of civilized space. He understood now why there was no explanation. The explanation was the danger. Not the occupants of the blank zone. Not their weapons, their gravitational manipulation, their ability to crush a military station with the casual precision of a hand closing. Those were threats. Yes, physical threats, measurable and quantifiable, the kind of things a military intelligence analyst could model and a defense planner could prepare for. The danger was the knowledge itself, because knowledge of this kind did not sit still. It moved. It spread. It reached the ears of officers who would hear threat and respond with force, politicians who would hear opportunity and respond with ambition, historians who would hear mystery and respond with investigation. And every response would bring someone closer to the line, and every crossing of the line would be heard. And every hearing would be met with patience. The patient, grieving patience of something that had already made this mistake once and did not want to make it again, but would if it had to. Cale closed the chart. He shut down the reading terminal. He gathered the diplomatic pouch and the classification stamps and the cover note from the tercel convocation and placed them in his desk's secure drawer. He would return the pouch in the morning with a formal reply. Provenance verified, document archived, no further action recommended. He would not mention the old charts. He would not mention the Kelvrathi. He would not mention the tone broadcasting from inside a dead station in the dark. He would not mention the messages, or the grief in their grammar, or the fact that the occupants of the blank zone had been listening to every signal that crossed the boundary for 4,000 years and had spoken only once, to one person to say, "Please go home." He stood in the doorway of the empty reading room and thought about the Vone Reach, the space that used to have a name and now had only a number. He thought about the line on the chart. He thought about who had drawn it and why, and what it had cost them to learn that the line was necessary. He thought about the Kelvrathi, who had looked at the line and chosen to cross it, and who did not exist anymore. And he thought about the last thing Torales had written, the line that had settled into Cale's mind the way sediment settles into bedrock, pressing down, compacting, becoming part of the structure of his thinking in a way he knew would never shift. They will come and they will be patient and they will ask us to stop. The reading room was silent. The archive was dark. Somewhere far beyond the station walls, far beyond the navigational charts, far beyond the red line that the galaxy had drawn and agreed never to explain, a tone was playing in the dark. It had been playing for 4,000 years. It would play for 4,000 more. It was playing for the dead, and the dead could not hear it, and the living were not meant to know it existed. Cale turned off the light and walked away. He did not look at the charts again. Not the next day, when the tercel convocation's courier came for the diplomatic pouch, and he handed it back with a form letter and a classification stamp. Not the next month, when a junior archivist asked him about Exclusion Zone 7 during a staff meeting, and he answered with the standard line, the line that every senior archivist before him had used, the line that he now understood was not a deflection but a warning. Some sectors are closed for a reason. The reason is not in the archive. If it were in the archive, someone would read it, and then the reason would need to be applied again. The junior archivist frowned and made a note and moved on to the next item on the agenda. She did not understand what he meant. None of them ever did. They heard the words and took them as bureaucratic caution, a senior officer's habit of deflection, a way of saying the file is classified without using the word classified. They did not hear what Cale heard in his own voice when he said it. The flat, careful tone of a man repeating a warning that he had received from someone who had received it from someone else. A chain of quiet voices stretching back through generations of archivists, each one carrying the same stone, each one passing it to the next with the same instruction. Do not drop it. Do not look at it. Do not ask what it is made of. He wondered sometimes how many senior archivists before him had found their own version of the folio. How many had read a document they should not have read, understood a silence they should not have understood, and then sealed the file and walked away and spent the rest of their careers guarding a door they could never explain to anyone else. The answer, he suspected, was all of them. He never explained. He served 17 more years as senior archivist. He cataloged 312 more closed sectors. He reviewed 4,700 more sealed files. He retired on schedule, handed his authorization keys to his successor, and moved to a quiet district on the station's residential level, where he spent his remaining years reading old navigational texts and drinking tea, and telling no one what he had found in a folio with the wrong date. The folio sat in the sealed stratum, unread, uncited, unknown. Its classification would expire in 800 years, when the authorization keys cycled and the access restrictions lapsed and some future archivist, some future historian, some future version of Soren Kale would unseal it and read it and sit alone in a dark room and understand. And on that day, in the blank space on the charts, the listening would become something else. But that was not today. Today the charts were blank. Today the line held. Today the tone played in the dark for the dead, and the galaxy moved through its business without knowing why one region of the maps carried no name and no history and no explanation, without knowing what lived in the silence beyond the line, without knowing why the oldest navigational records in the Tercel archive had been painted over with coordinates that pointed nowhere, and why every senior archivist who had ever been asked about it had given the same answer, in the same flat voice, with the same look in their eyes, the look of someone who had carried a stone for a long time and had learned to walk with it. Today the galaxy did not know. And the tone played on. And the listeners in the space beyond the line were patient. They had always been patient. They would continue to be patient for as long as patience was enough.